Now the time is for technical sessions. There are 4 parallel technical sessions. One of the report would be launched here by Dr. Hafiz Pasha, and then there are 3 technical sessions in the other building.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Abdullah Dayo, Program Coordinator working with Friedrich Ebert Stiftung.
My name is Jochen Hippler. I'm a political scientist from Germany, and I'm the country director of Friedrich Ebert Foundation, or FES, in Pakistan, which is a big pleasure for me being here. Today we are launching the study of Dr. Hafiz Pasha, as you know, the former Minister of Finance and an eminent economist from Pakistan, which he has done in cooperation with FES. The study is called Charter of the Economy, Agenda for an Economic Reforms in Pakistan, which has more than 300 pages and has just been printed. And obviously the idea is to try to contribute to have a discussion how to best get Pakistan out of the economic problems. So before a few sentences, I just want to say hello to Dr. Pasha, who I assume is already hearing and maybe even seeing us. Good afternoon, Dr. Pasha.
Good afternoon.
Wonderful. You are sitting behind me, Dr. Pasha. Okay. So let me just make a very few remarks. What I think makes this study very special, very timely, and very important is that it has been written by an eminent economist, but at the same time by a person who is aware that the economy of a country is not in an island far away from life, but it is very much interconnected with society, with politics, with ecology, and with other things, and that we can only deal with basic economic problems if they are not cut off from rest of society and rest of politics and ecology and demographics and what you have. So this, this study, this book, is really trying to come up with suggestions with reform agenda for Pakistan, which is integrating economic factors, economic suggestions with non-economic ones. And since I'm not a speaker here, but just a moderator, I will give you only one example. I think the assumption, and we will hear Dr. Pasha in a minute, the assumption is that you cannot have a successful economic reform in a country like Pakistan without political stability and with a broad political consensus how the economic policy should look like. If there is a polarized situation, if many government institutions are not functioning properly, suggestion on change this economic variable or another one will probably be futile. So the point here is that if this wonderful country really wants to have a dynamic, progressive, successful economy, it's not enough to fix 1 or 2 or 3 variables on the macroeconomic chessboard. It is important to also have a functioning, creative, reliable governance system which is actually able to pursue economic policy consistently and wisely. I think this is one of the examples. There are many more in the book, but not to turning myself into a speaker, I just hand over to Dr. Pasha for his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hippler. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. I am grateful for the opportunity given by the Pakistan Institute of Development Economics to present this effort on a comprehensive agenda of reforms titled Charter of the Economy. The initiative has been taken on the behest of 2 of the leaders of the major political parties of Pakistan. Requests were made to me by the president of the Pakistan Muslim League, Nawaz, and by the chairperson of the Pakistan People's Party through his Punjab head. And we took the initiative, and I am enormously grateful to Friedrich Ebert Stiftung Foundation, with whom I have had a long-standing relationship over the last over 2 decades, and their commitment to democracy is what has motivated me to be a partner with them on many of their efforts in Pakistan. I would like to thank my team of very bright young economists, but I would also like to acknowledge the support and provided to me and guidance by one of my colleagues at the Beacon House University, our Vice Chancellor, Mr. Shahid Kardar. The effort basically is to try and, as Dr. Hepler has identified, come up with an interdisciplinary and multidimensional perspective on economic reform. And that is why you will find when I give you a description of the contents of the book, you will get a sense as to how comprehensive it has tended to be. And in particular, because this is the first humble effort by a Pakistani professor, I was very keen that there should be a very careful diagnosis first of the problem, and before we make recommendations for solution, because there could be significant differences, particularly in the identification of particular solutions. And I look forward to the time when hopefully this initiative will spark off discussion among groups of economists and other practitioners in different fields, and also create some interest within civil society and in the various echelons of the political parties. I would like to thank in particular the participants in the first launch by us, which was to civil society earlier this month, where we got some extremely useful comments and advice. And as we move ahead, I'm sure the galaxy of economists in our country and political scientists and government specialists and so on will really help us contribute towards building this agenda. I am working on the presumption that Pakistan will need a kind of a consensus at the civil society as well as at the political level to be able to forge ahead with truly a structural reform agenda. Ladies and gentlemen, today, only the last 2 days, we have been telling people about what the reaction is likely to be to perhaps the toughest set of reforms imposed on us by the International Monetary Fund. And I dread the time over the next few weeks and months when, for instance, yesterday, my students and I, we have a macroeconomic model and we used it to project the rate of inflation over the next 6 to 9 months. And I'm afraid it's high double digit in the range of 15 to 17%, which is a quantum jump from the 9% we have seen in the month of October. There are other such problems which will come up, but the government seems to have opted for the implementation of this program, given, of course, it's very severe foreign exchange constraint, but Pakistan has to move ahead and develop ultimately a strong structural reform agenda, in particular to avoid the boom and bust cycles which characterized our economic performance for years to come. So I'd like to start by first taking you through the contents of the book. Can you move, please? Change the... Move to the next one, please. Okay. This is the, if you like, the visual presentation of the book. And you will notice first that the emphasis is very much on improved governance. And by that we mean particularly devolution, delivery of services, market regulation, and more ease of doing business. These are 4 of the critical areas to promote investment and production activities in particularly the private sector, the support that is necessary from the public domain. Then we focus on the design and implementation of policies, and of particular importance today is the fiscal policy on which the IMF's 6th review has laid a great deal of emphasis on, and then of course also on monetary policy, some initiatives taken in the last few days, trade policy, and a whole bunch of other policies, for example, those relating to the development of particular sectors. Then the very important to have a stable economy, and that is why we're focusing particularly in the context of ensuring over the next few years that the level of public debt in Pakistan as a percentage of GDP begins to come down significantly. And then, of course, Pakistan needs to have high foreign exchange reserves, because this is what keeps taking us back to the IMF 22 times in the last 43 years. And it is important that we have reserve cover, which is comfortable, maybe 4 to 5 months of reserves. And then, of course, what we need to do in terms of specific sectoral interventions. And to me, perhaps the most important set of interventions relate to agriculture, followed by industry and power sector, and of course the services also. And then we move finally to more inclusive growth, where the emphasis is on promoting human development, greater employment absorption. And I'm very, very particular about the focus on backward areas growth, and I'll hopefully be able to tell you reasons why. Poverty reduction, and I close the book with the ultimate message that Pakistan needs to reduce its population growth if it wants to have an ability to generate a surplus. So the various parts of the book are, there are in fact 11 components, and I'll just quickly take you through. The first are the targets: improving governance, strengthening the federation, mobilizing resources, reducing expenditure, and containing government debt. I'll be focusing, because I don't have time to go through all the parts of the book, I'll particularly focus on this section in my subsequent remarks. And then, of course, raising the level of investment, improving the balance of payments, accelerating economic growth, striving for balanced regional development, focusing on human development, providing more employment opportunities, achieving more poverty alleviation and social protection. Let me turn now to the targets in the Charter of the Economy. The focus is on 5 years, with 2020-21 being the base year and 2024-25 being the, if you like, the terminal year. It also happens to coincide with the year when the SDGs are likely to be hopefully achieved in many countries. Now, I will not go through this in great detail, but simply say that Pakistan has witnessed a plummeting of its growth rate, a precipitous fall in its investment from a peak of 21% to below 14% of the GDP last year. Private investment, which had reached a level of 16% of the GDP, unfortunately last year was down to 10%. We have had 2 serious bouts of inflation, one between 2008 and 12, and last 3 years we have witnessed inflation averaging almost 9%. The public finances position has that Pakistan's tax to GDP ratio did reach a peak of 13%, but has since fallen to below 11%. Current expenditure continues to rise, particularly because of the growing debt servicing bundle. And what is really unfortunate is that the development spending on infrastructure has fallen from a peak of 5.3% of the GDP in 2016-17 to only 2.8% of the GDP last year. And this is really one of the reasons why our growth rate is increasingly constrained. In terms of the imbalances, the budget deficit was as low as 4.6% 5 years ago. It rose to a peak of almost 9% and has since, fortunately, last year come down to 7%, but still high. And we have a very large primary deficit, which means that our public debt continues to grow. Our government debt stood at 54% a decade ago. Now it has risen to 75%, and total national debt now is 100% of our economy. I mean, this is really where we stand. Finally, on the balance of payments and employment and poverty, I mean, exports did show exceptional buoyancy in the first decade of the century, but have since been flat. Today, imports are almost 2.5 times our exports. The annual debt repayment external has almost quadrupled in the last decade. And this is a shocking statistic that net foreign exchange reserves of Pakistan are negative today after deduction of all liabilities, as per the international definition of net foreign exchange reserves. Unfortunately, because of COVID, the unemployment rate, which had come down somewhat to 6%, has now perhaps more than doubled after the COVID-19 attack and may have come down a little bit in the last few months. The incidence of poverty had fallen to 31% by 2017-18. Now it is above, we estimate, 40%. The targets that we have in the Charter of Economy, they are fairly modest. We are trying to be realistic, but nevertheless, we are trying to attempt a significant improvement in the performance of our economy. GDP growth rate, we are targeting that by the terminal year, it should get up to 6%. This is the rate we used to be able to maintain in a few of the decades, like the 60s, the 80s, and for some part of the first decade of the century. Level of the investment is crucial. Pakistan has to raise it by almost 4 percentage points because our capital output ratio is roughly 3. And if we want to get to 6%, we will have to do that. As I've already mentioned, we want to bring down the unemployment rate back again to 6%, reduce the rate of inflation to close to Pakistan's long-term rate of inflation is about 6%, and we have to get it back to that rate in the years to come. On the public finance front, the revenues, as I've said, will have to raise by from 14.6% to 18.4% of the GDP, almost 4 percentage points. And in my subsequent remarks, I will tell you the strategy for doing so. Expenditures, particularly current expenditures, have to come down. And again, I'll be highlighting the kind of moves that could be made. As I've mentioned, the budget deficit has to be brought down to 5%. This means we will generate a primary surplus. And finally, we hope that we can get government debt down to 70%. According to the Fiscal Responsibility and Debt Limitation Act, it should be at 60%. Hopefully, if we can build the momentum, then in the next 5 years after that, perhaps Pakistan can finally, hopefully get down to somewhere near that limit imposed by the Fiscal Responsibility and Debt Limitation Act. Balance of payments. These, by the way, these are percentages are wrong. These are actually $1 billion. And so we are hoping that we can contain by 2024-25 the current account deficit to about $9.5 billion, which is close to the projected GDP. It will be about 2.5% of the projected GDP, and that is a sustainable level. And then the other, finally, on the foreign exchange reserves, we are hoping we can get them up to $25 billion. This is the minimum, and hopefully that will be at least 4 months of reserves. Next, of imports. Now, since I have limited time, I will focus on some key reforms in 1 or 2 critical areas. First, let me focus on what we generally sometimes refer to as achieving good economic governance. And I, as always, fall back on the guidelines of the Constitution of Pakistan, amended thereof by the 18th Amendment, as the guiding principle behind many of our objectives and guidelines and even strategies. The first is, unfortunately, the constitutional prime fora of Pakistan given by the Constitution are the National Economic Council and the Council of Common Interests, both with the Prime Minister as the Honorable Chairperson, and of course with provincial representations. The Constitution asks for regular meetings and also a presentation of the annual report to the Parliament. There is a desperate need for the highest level of policy making fora to become active in Pakistan. One of the tragedies has been that these two fora have met very infrequently and have not been able to provide the kind of high-level political and policy guidance which is needed for Pakistan to move ahead. It also provides for a degree of accountability of performance. We also suggest that the Planning Commission should be the secretariat for these fora, and in the book I've also suggested that the Pakistan Institute of Development Economics must be more actively involved in the policy work of the Planning Commission. Parliamentary committees have generally been bypassed, and I'm afraid the current assembly does not seem to have that strong a performance in terms of the performance of the assembly as a whole and the committees. But the Constitution sees these committees as entry points for all legislation for accountability of ministries. Then I come to a radical new suggestion which is in line with the spirit of the federation. Pakistan is a federation. And as was said, Pakistan must learn to thrive with unity in diversity. This has to be our strength. And therefore, there is a need to move away from top-down planning, which we have seen with Islamabad being especially dominant in terms of the annual plan preparation and so on, but to move much more towards bottom-up planning, nearer to the action, nearer to the identification of the constraints, and nearer to the better and closer realization of actions and strategies required. In our view, regional plans may be prepared by provincial governments. These should be aggregated along with the federal plan, which should ensure that there is a macroeconomic framework which is consistent with the realization of these plans. It's interesting that the Government of India Act provides a common history of federations for India and Pakistan. India has been doing this kind of top-down planning for a long time. But to achieve this, many improvements are required in the economic information system and statistics, and this comes very close to the kind of work we would expect institutions like PIDE to be able to do, along with the Pakistan Bureau of Statistics. In particular, it is amazing that Pakistan does not have a quarterly GDP series by sector. There was an attempt made about 5-6 years ago, but a fundamental lack of realization that in Pakistan, we must realize that our economic activity continues to be driven by crop seasons. And unfortunately, the attempt that was made last time ignored this key element of seasonality in economic activity in our country. Then, of course, we need annual estimation of provincial GDPs. The first initiative in this area was taken by one of my very outstanding students at the University of Karachi, Dr. Kaisar Bengali, who produced estimates up to 1999-2000. And since then, two other PhD students of mine have updated it. And we have estimates. Now, the breakthrough we have achieved is not only do we have annual estimation of provincial GDPs by sector, but with very in-depth research, we have been able to construct GDP series for the provincial governments by expenditure. And this is extremely revealing. One of the fascinating findings is the extent of the trade deficit, both in domestic and international trade, of each province. I won't tell you what the results are. Hopefully you'll have a look at the book and you'll get to know which province is in surplus, which province is in deficit. And then, of course, we need to develop an SDGs database at the district level. And you'll be amazed, the last economic census goes back 15 years. I mean, this is really very unfortunate. I mean, even if you want to develop an up-to-date tax base, you need to have clearly have censuses at least once every 10 years. Now I come to the bottom line. And let me start by saying that I completely and totally disagree with the strategy proposed by the in the 6th review, clearly with agreement by the government of Pakistan in the IMF program to focus on indirect taxes. Believe it or not, if you include the withholding taxes of an indirect nature in the income tax, they add up to the indirect taxes are 75% of total tax revenues. Excuse me. So this business about in the next few weeks coming up with a mini budget focusing on so-called broad basing of the sales tax is something which I completely and totally disagree. Instead, the proposed effort should have been on progressive direct tax reforms, including the following. Pakistan is perhaps a unique country which does not tax total income, but taxes block-wise income. So for instance, if you get interest income, you pay 10%, and that's it, even though your marginal tax rate may be 25, 30%. So this is extremely contrary to progressive taxation. And this alone can give us an additional 100 to 150 billion. Then Pakistan has an amazing personal income tax system with 12 slabs compared to 6 or even 5 in the other South Asian countries. And the amazing thing is that Pakistan's highest rate is attained at a per capita income, which is 200 times more than the average per capita income in the country. This is ridiculous. In most of the countries, it's about 10 to 12 times the average income. So we'll have to reduce the slabs, compress the tax system, and make it more progressive. And this alone can fetch another 70 to 100 billion rupees. Similarly, many countries have progressive corporate income tax with higher tax rates. And if there are unusual surpluses being generated, for example, we have seen sometimes in the banking sector, we have seen sometimes in other sectors like cement and pharmaceuticals and so on and so forth, due to transfer pricing in some cases, due to a degree of monopolistic power and so on, there should be a progressive corporate income tax. And very, very important, particularly for the speculative part of the economy, for some strange reason, we have come up with the concept of what's known as a holding period. So if you hold your property for more than, say, 6 years, and then you sell it, you pay no capital gains tax. This is truly amazing. At least what you should be doing, there should be no concept of a holding period. Instead, we can vary the rate in line with inflation so that we end up taxing real property gains irrespective of the holding period. This is what happens in most countries in the world. As far as the indirect tax reforms in the second phase of the reform process are concerned, we need to make a transition to a national integrated value-added tax on goods and services. Today it is partitioned between the federal and provincial governments. And interestingly, the provincial governments have been engaging in a race to the bottom. They're reducing their tax rates so that they can attract the mobile tax bases. And this is really very counterproductive. So Pakistan needs to have a standardized tax rate and one common return on goods and services. This would help us enormously in moving towards a rational and a neutral value-added tax on goods and services, which would not discriminate against particular economic activities. Surprisingly, again, Pakistan does not tax services imports. And many countries have done this on the reverse charge principle. The least we could do is have an import duty, say, of 5% and tax them. Please go back. And I want to just quickly go through the provincial side, and that is the levy of the agricultural income tax. We have some very interesting statistics here. According to the agricultural census, only 1% of the farmers own 20% of the land, the largest farmers, 22% in fact. Their net incomes last year we estimated is close to ₹1 trillion. And how much tax have they paid in the agricultural income tax out of 1,000 billion? Hardly 3 billion. I mean, this is truly a mockery of progressive taxation. Then, of course, assessment of the gross annual rental value of property for the payment of urban immovable property tax. This relates to the urban residential properties which are in affluent neighborhoods. You will be pleased to know that the entire collection from the urban immovable property tax in Pakistan is of a wonderful 9 billion rupees from all cities in the country. In Mumbai alone, the Metropolitan Corporation there picks up the equivalent of 75 billion rupees. There's enormous scope for increased progressive taxation in Pakistan through the 7 or 8 mechanisms that I've talked of, instead of getting obsessed with taxing sales tax, essential items. I mean, there may even be taxes in the next few days or weeks on essential items, including, for example, in our case, stationery, books, and so on. Next. Let me turn to economy and current expenditure. Cost of pensions, you will be amazed. If you combine the federal and provincial governments, believe it or not, it is approaching 1 trillion rupees. It has doubled in 5 years. And there is pressure constantly for further escalations. What is the option? Because we never developed a scheme of contributory pensions, and the end result is that the entire liability falls on the current budget, and there is no concept of pension funds. One of the provinces has come up with a good suggestion. We support that. Given some increase in the life expectancy, perhaps we can increase the retirement age to 63 years and establish contributory pension scheme for new employees and establishment of pension funds. Then the other monolith elephant are the over 200 attached departments and autonomous bodies in the federal government, including many of these SOEs, with employment exceeding 1 billion rupees. I undertook a zero-based budgeting of each of these entities when I was the deputy chairman of the Planning Commission almost 23 years ago. And we were able to do some cutting at that time. The time has come for another exercise in zero-based budgeting of each entity. They have to justify why they should continue to exist and get subsidy from the government. Then, given similarity in functions, we have suggested the merger of 20 divisions at the federal level. And privatization of SOEs, believe it or not, SOEs are currently imposing a net burden on the federal budget of almost 750 to 800 billion rupees. And this number rises exponentially every year. 6 years ago, it was hardly 150 billion. And then I've gone through various criteria for privatization. Could you move finally to the last slide? Let me turn to the last key area. And I go back, go back. Yes. Now just go one down. Please go one down. Yes, and this is it. Because I'm talking about public finances, so I'm focusing on the 3 parts: revenues, current, and development spending. Now, here are some shocking statistics also. As I mentioned earlier, the level of public development spending, if we go to an even earlier year, is almost half of what it used to be. And what is truly amazing, and this is a reflection of the politics of project selection and identification, that the federal PSDP is literally spread too thin, currently with as many as 1,023 projects being implemented simultaneously, and you can begin to wonder where the implementation capacity is. And believe it or not, the throw forward, which is the remaining costs of ongoing projects, are over 8 times the annual allocation. I mean, this is a classic exercise of literally going too thin and way beyond limits. And this has led to big cost overruns and delays in implementation. According to recent World Bank estimates, a typical project in Pakistan, as contained in the PC1, if it is to be completed in X years, it is usually completed in 2 to 2.5x years. No wonder the costs are going up. We have made 3 or 4 recommendations to really make the development spending much more focused, particularly since the outlays have become smaller and smaller. The impact on growth is the greatest of investments in hydropower, irrigation, for power generation, transmission and distribution, water and power distribution, rather than the obsession, with all due respects, if I can be a bit sacrilegious. The largest sector for a very long time in terms of allocation continues to be highways, highways, highways. Our econometric analysis of impact of public investments on growth has revealed to us that the impact of highway development is perhaps not as large anywhere near water and power. So there is a need to move towards this. Sectors raise allocations substantially and limit the maximum share to 10% on new projects. The federal PSDP has many small splinter projects. For example, you'll be amazed that there are almost 30 small projects of roads in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. I mean, this is really, in a sense, the responsibility of the provincial government. And finally, the scope for public-private partnership in infrastructure projects should be carefully examined. Here again, we can see the type of projects which are amenable to public-private partnerships by looking at the vast portfolio of PPP projects that are being implemented, particularly in the states of India. I'll have to stop here because I have run out of time, but let me tell you that I have given to you in these 3 presentations on critical reforms about 8 to 10% of my total recommendations. My total set of recommendations are, of course, much more diversified, and some of them can be provocative in character. Hopefully, they will stimulate debate, and I hope some of you who are sub-area specialists would look at this book and begin to question it and try and come up with even better and qualitatively superior proposals, strategies, and reforms. Thank you very much for your very patient hearing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pasha, for concisely summarizing this very, 320-page report. Maybe that's the time, before we open up to the audience, to mention that today we have already distributed approximately 200 copies of the report to people at the bookstall. Now we have been running out of copies except 2 or 3, but I was asked to announce that tomorrow there will be more copy of the report to be given away on the bookstall. We also have done a summary of the main recommendations in Urdu as well, because this book is written in English and not everybody in Pakistan is very fluent. Having said that, we can collect rounds of questions directed to Dr. Pasha, and then he could answer. The 2 of you would be first. Is anybody? Then it's up to you. Anybody can deliver a microphone, please? Can we have a microphone? Because Dr. Pasha will not hear
Mic
you.
chahiye honge.
Well, yeah, there it is. The second row, please. Yes.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. It was a very big presentation and lot of data. So I may not remember everything, but I just want to invite attention to 2, 3 figures that how these will be managed. One of the figure was shown that we have achieved once 21% investment of our GDP. That was probably our first 5-year plan. And that was made possible because of massive transfer of resources, particularly from United States. It was not from our domestic resources. Now in this charter, I see they're planning to increase the investment from around 14% to about 18% to achieve about 6% growth rate. What's the mechanism? Our household savings are almost stagnant. Mostly we depend on net income from abroad, remittances. Government savings are negative. Corporate savings are also negligible. So how we are going to achieve this 17 to 18% investment growth in 1 year? Same is the case with the current account deficit, particularly the trade deficit. How we are going to bring down or reduce this gap so quickly? This is now a kind of problem for the last 6-7 years. The trade deficit is around $30 billion, and at one stage our total import due to $50 billion. We can say a number of things, but what's the mechanism? How we can achieve these targets so quickly in 1 or 2 years? We must have some clear understanding that we can achieve these targets, and these are not simply targets on the paper.
Thank you very much. The gentleman next to you.
Thank you, Dr. Hafiz Pasha Sahab. I may not be, frankly speaking, I am not an economic expert. From the economic point of view, our Dean Sahab asked questions. My questions are very blunt. 2 questions. The first question, if this book is considered as a Magna Carta, and we put this book before the present government, what is the hurdle behind the implementation of this book in toto? One question. The second question is, you were the Federal Minister for Planning some years back. Were these statistics not clear to you when you were the minister? What were the hurdles at that time that you could not implement all these things at that time? Thank you so much.
Thank you. Maybe we
Can I respond to these 2 questions, Dr. Hipla?
Yes, if you don't want 3, we start
Because
with
they are
2.
2 very leading questions, and it is important that I answer them, and we can have another round of 2 questions after this,
Sure.
okay?
Then just go ahead, please. Yes.
Okay, both very leading questions, and I'm grateful for the interest shown. And of course, some of the answers you can find when you go through the details in the book contained, but let me begin to answer some of them in a somewhat broader sense. The investment to GDP ratio that I've quoted was in the earlier part of the century, not in the, if you like, way back at the time of Field Marshal Ayub Khan. Yes, we have always had the advantage that our investment rate tends to somewhat go up when we have what we call the spillover effects of being a client state with respect to some superpower. And that has been the case particularly during military governments. And that is the reason why the level of investment and the growth rate thereof has been somewhat higher. I have gone through very carefully all the investment part of the economy, and there is a whole section on raising investment, particularly private investment, financing it in particular. What are these potential incentives that we need to offer, and what kind of support and backup has to be provided by governmental agencies? That's all in the report. Please have a look at it. And I've been very modest because, in fact, PIDE itself expects in their report, which came out some time ago, PID was saying that the GDP growth rate should be probably raised to 8 to 9%. I didn't have the courage to do so, and I've opted instead for a figure which is perhaps more feasible of 6%. Inshallah, hopefully sometime we might be able to do this. On the current account deficit, I wish I had focused a bit more if I'd had time on the balance of payments, which is clearly a critical issue these days. And I would have loved to have talked about how to promote exports. And please have a look at that particular chapter. There are some innovative ideas linked partly to our historical experience and partly to the mechanisms that have been adopted by successful exporting countries to promote exports, how we can learn from that experience. Then, of course, we come to the issue of what did you do? Now, I had the privilege of being the deputy chairman for a very short period in the Ministry of Finance, and from the late 1996 as part of the caretaker government to 1998, soon after the bomb explosions. 2 or 3 things which I was very keen to promote, and I plead for some success because Unfortunately, we could not go beyond because after the bomb explosion by Pakistan in 1998, we were faced with sanctions by the United States of America and we came perilously close to default. I take pride in being the person in charge of the finances in saving Pakistan from a default. And I want to put on record our appreciation of support from Muslim countries and China at a critical time in Pakistan's history. I also want to say that I have been ill since then, and for the last 20 years, I've paid a price for having sleepless nights and looking after more or less a loss of financial status of our country. But Pakistan has come back. And I think that decision of ours has saved us from serious regional conflicts and difficulties. One of the things which we were very keen to do when I was the deputy chairman, I have always had this inclination towards promoting agriculture because I think that it is the comparative advantage. And living in Punjab since childhood and spending some years, of course, later in Karachi, I've always felt that if we were to make a breakthrough, then perhaps we would need to really utilize our comparative advantage in agricultural exports. So we did that. And let me tell you that one of my greatest sources of satisfaction was that by 1999, Pakistan became self-sufficient in wheat. We had been a net importer. Now, unfortunately, 20 years later, last year, we again went back into a deficit. Ever since the Musharraf government, with all due respect, agriculture has been put on the back burner. To me, this was the key sector. And you know, one of my students has just finished research through the input-output matrix of Pakistan for 2010-11, and 46% of the economy of Pakistan hinges on the agricultural sector, directly or indirectly. So it is very important that we achieve that. But I will again profess to modesty. At a difficult time in Pakistan's history, we were able to achieve very limited goals, but thank God, we took Pakistan out of a very difficult financial situation. Allah ka shukr. 2 more questions.
Yes, please. There was one on the left side and maybe one behind, and then we move back to you. Can we take 3 maybe, sir? Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Last round.
The microphone should be over there, please. Oh, I couldn't see you because of the light was blinding me, but the first gentleman was on the left here.
Dr. Hafiz Pasha, it's an honor to speak to you. I'm a student from Punjab University. My name is Muhammad Haris Mohsin. One of the basic questions which I would want to ask at this moment is about the privatization of the state-owned enterprises and the delays which the current government is having. One blunt statement which I would like to say is having Mia Muhammad Somro as the Chief of Planning Commission for privatization has not given much results. So I want to ask you, what would you suggest to the current government and even the next governments which would like to come in few years about the privatization of the state-owned enterprises, especially railway and the Pakistan steel mills and PIA? Thank you.
Thank you. The next one was further up. Yeah. And then the gentleman in the dark whom I couldn't see.
Hello. I would like to ask this one question about the political will. Of course, we could throw economic jargons, economic variable on people, but the question is that when, in the absence of the political will, how could we expect that this country would basically go towards the economic development, right? Again, it is very unfortunate that in the institutions, the major economic institutions such as PIDE and IBN, etc., we don't really get to see discussion over the questions about the 18th Amendment and the NFC. We just don't know what is going on with the NFC award. You know, we had got the information regarding the NFC award when during the time of the Zardari government, but we just don't know anything about it right now. So my question is that in the absence of political will, how could we go towards the economic development? I mean, it is impossible.
Thank you. The last one of this round, and then we will have another one, is you here in front.
Hafiz Parvez Tahir here. Thank you for proposing that Planning Commission should be the Secretariat of CCI and National Economic Council. I have been saying that ever since the 18th Amendment. So thank you for putting your weight behind it. My question is that you said the two main parties are approaching you for working out a consensus for them, which partially answers the question of political will. But what you are proposing here is essentially a macroeconomic framework. I don't think you need a consensus on that. The consensus you need is on reform, the set of reforms, and some concrete things like do not destroy the projects started by a previous government and so on. When they do these kinds of mutually destructive things, we need to stop them. And I noticed that you're working on the pattern of charter of democracy, and it is the same two parties. But then we need to sort of identify the doables. I mean, you would know more than me that the macroeconomic framework can change tomorrow, but there are few principles that we should give them, that please follow these principles, come what may.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Dr. Pasha, please.
I'm really very, very pleased with the quality of the questions that have come, which means that we have managed to evoke a very meaningful response from the participants of this event. I'd like to go back a little bit to the question which was asked in the first round, and what is the government's view on all this? While the two main parties may have, and I've actually gone and personally given a copy each to Mr. Bhutto and to Mr. Shahbaz Sharif, because they were the ones who initiated this idea. The President of Pakistan, Honorable President, asked for copies, and we were able, through FES, was able to provide copies to the President of Pakistan. More recently, I have received requests, particularly from the Ministry of Finance, and we are there to assist the government. Now, you know, somehow or the other, I have this lingering faith at the fag end of my life that I have seen Pakistan come together in a remarkable way once in more recent history, and that is in the war on terror. What we saw after the army public school horrible incident of children being massacred, the consensus that was emerged between the civilian and the military establishment, and the formulation of a national action plan with Zarb-e-Azb following it. We had already lost about 80,000 lives and over $200 billion economic losses. And somehow or the other, Allah ka shukr hai, we are grateful to the Almighty that terrorism has been curtailed to a large extent because of the joint efforts. Inshallah, a time will come when, God forbid, and this IMF program, the way it is coming out now, portends to be leading to a very major economic crisis in Pakistan. Implementation of the prior actions and the tough reforms, all more or less at the same time, is going to really create a very, very difficult situation. As I just said, our estimates are inflation rate doubling or so. So, Allah chahe, something similar to the coming together in the war on terror, against the war on terror. Can we not come together as a country, civil society, political leadership, intelligentsia, and so on, in ensuring that there is a consensus on a kind of a reform package? I agree totally with Dr. Parvez Tahir, one of my most esteemed colleagues. We've been together for decades. Yes, I of course had a little bias, having served as a deputy chairman myself towards the plan. See, what is a tragedy in Pakistan is that over the last almost 50 years, the Planning Commission has been downgraded in importance. And this is truly tragic. We've moved into a kind of a crisis management mindset with the Ministry of Finance. The time has come once again to enhance the importance of the planning process in our country. If you please go through my 23 pages of recommendations, you will see within them many which are entirely operational in character and very, very micro-specific. And some, of course, deal with bigger policy issues, but I've been very careful, and I'm glad and truly, truly grateful to the Frederick Ebert Stiftung Foundation for at least ensuring that while we can begin to ignore the 340 pages or so, or 380 pages, we can certainly ensure wider dissemination of the summary of recommendations. And I'm truly grateful that it has also been converted and translated into Urdu. Thanks a lot for all those wonderful comments. Frankly, given my state of health, Dr. Hippler, I'm not sure whether I can take another extended set of questions, but if you want me to do so, I will.
Well, thank you very much. No, if health is involved, there is very little space to discussion. I'm aware that you are not extremely healthy. So I just want to thank you very, very much for being willing to talk to us here in Peshawar from Lahore. And my best wishes for improving health and for a fruitful work in the future, that more things will come out of it. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
And at the same time, I want to thank the audience for being interested in this. I think we have a very important discussion have had here and a very important study. And as I said before, if you didn't get a copy of the report, we will be providing more tomorrow at the bookstall outside, so you can take another copy. We didn't expect that in a very short time today we had to give away more than 200 copies, besides other publications which we brought from Islamabad. So we were a little bit overwhelmed with the response and the interest, but we will bring more tomorrow. Thank you very much for attending this session.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr.